Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. By way of introduction, my name is David Nye, and I'm the Major Airports Manager at the Australian Airports Association. This morning, for technical assistance, please phone Redback Support on 1800 733 416. And if you'd like to listen to this webinar through your phone instead, please dial in the number and passcode that is listed in the chat box. Today, the AAA presents its third webinar for 2018, and the topic is Sprayed Sealing for Airports, presented by Greg White, Director of the Airport Pavement Research Program at the University of the Sunshine Coast. Today's webinar will cover the following topics: sprayed sealed versus asphalt surfaces, differences between road and airport seals, treatment options, seal design, seal construction, standardized design and specification development. The opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. To ask Greg a question, please use the chat box, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen, just to the right of the cogwheel. After typing out your question, hit enter to submit. Greg will answer the questions as we go through the webinar relating to the content or anything else towards the end of the presentation. Before we start, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Greg for his participation today. And without any further ado, we'll begin the webinar. So over to Greg.
Thanks, David. Morning all. As David said, we'll talk about spray seal for airports. I must admit that when I wrote those few dot points for Anne about what we would cover today, it was quite a while ago. So I hope I do all of those justice and actually cover them as we go through. In terms of the pavement series of webinars, this is the third. We talked about a general introduction to airport pavements in August last year, and then asphalt and bitumen late last year. This one's spray sealing for airports, and then the next one, which I think is in July from memory, is pavement thickness and ACN PCN. So of all the things that I think, or in my experience, that in particular the regional airports are challenged by, my three hot points are spray sealing, ACN PCN, and friction and skid resistance, which is the one after, which I'm guessing will be later in the year, maybe October or November, something like that. So we're really into the guts of these seminars now, or webinars, and it remains my intention that we might get to wrap all these things together into a one-day regional airport focused training event in association with a pavement and lighting forum or something like that down the track. So we'll see how that idea progresses with time. This is my scope anyway. I hope it looks a little bit similar to the scope that David read out and was advertised. But without dwelling on that too much, we'll just get stuck in. Now, I've got a bit of a disclaimer here, because normally I try to avoid at all costs very categorical and negative statements, because generally whenever somebody says no, you can never do that, then sure as egg someone will come up with an example of where it's been done and worked quite well. But a lot of these spray sealing issues are, I think, poorly understood, and in some cases have been understood but not given the respect that they probably deserve. So I've probably used in this presentation stronger language than otherwise I would normally be comfortable with. I even made them red, bold, and in big letters, so you'll see those when they come. But I acknowledge from the start that for every one of those statements, then there's certainly the odd example potentially where those things would be proven wrong. So you have to take the big nots and don'ts and musts with a small grain of salt. But it's really just to emphasise the importance of those issues, not to really be categorical as they're actually written. So starting with spray sealing, for those that aren't aware, which I'm assuming might be too many, spray sealing an airport, we put a film of bitumen on the ground, we spray it, hence the name spray seal, and then we cover it with what is intended to be a single-sized layer, 1 particle thick of aggregate. So it's not a graded material like goes into asphalt, and it's not a graded material like goes into a crush rock base course. We then roll that aggregate into the bitumen film, and we hope it sticks and stays there for a long time. So sprayed seals aren't asphalt. Asphalt is a completely different thing, and we'll talk a little bit later about comparing those. It's not bitumen. Bitumen is the first bit, the sprayed film, but it's bitumen plus the aggregate, and it's not microsurfacing, which is, I guess, a technology relatively new to the airport space in Australia that provides a similar outcome, but using a very different process that we won't talk about today, but it's probably worth talking about in an event somewhere in relation to regional airports. Spray sealing is usually suited, or it's highly suited to small quantities of work, because the equipment required, and we'll talk about that later as well, is relatively small and mobile and transportable in comparison to, say, asphalt production and construction equipment, which also makes it very suited to remote airports locations. And we'll talk about the relative economics of asphalt versus spray seal a bit later on, because it's an important equation for a regional airport considering what new surface to put on their runway down the track. Spray sealing also doesn't provide significant shape correction. We've been quite successful in doing a little bit of isolated sealing in wheel path depressions from time to time, and then putting a new seal over an entire surface just to try and fill those depressions up before the new surface goes down. That has been quite successful. It's quite a fiddly thing to do, but generally it doesn't provide the same kind of shape correction as certainly as asphalt or other solutions will provide. Photo showing the bitumen being sprayed, typically 170 or 180 degrees, something in that order, depending on the product, the weather conditions, sprayed out of a purpose-built truck that's probably not unfamiliar to many people. And then the spreading of the aggregate out of just a generally normal tip truck with a special box fitted to the back to distribute the aggregate in a controlled way. You can see there that the bitumen spray is quite wide, quite often 5 metres is typical. The trucks themselves might spread at about 2 metres, which means you have a couple of trucks lined up to spread aggregate over the full width of the bitumen in a single process before the bitumen goes cold, which is the key, getting those rocks on and in before the bitumen cools down to a temperature where you can't roll it in. And speaking of rolling it in, that's a roller, but we always need more than one, particularly on an airport seal, and we'll talk about that equation a little bit later on, because it's one of the things that sometimes gets missed. That's an example of what's not far off being the finished product. It's a 10mm single seal over the top of an existing sprayed seal pavement, and then down the bottom is an illustrative cross section, which really shows that there's a couple of terms that we probably need to get our heads around when talking about this stuff. One is the ALD, the average least dimension. So in theory, let's go back. In theory, the ALD should always be orientated upwards or vertically after all the rolling's been done. You can see the particle 1 to the right of that probably isn't in that orientation. And we're really looking for the binder volume over here in an airport sense to be somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 up the ALD, leaving just a small portion of the stones sticking up above the bitumen film in order to maintain an appropriately textured surface over the life of the seal. One of the big mistakes I think I see some of the regional airports making some of them on a reasonably regular basis is putting road seals on their runways. And certainly the equipment and the materials are the same, but the design solutions are driven by completely different requirements. Runways have low traffic frequency, even compared to very remote or very remote roads for traffic frequency on a runway. After all, the 2/3 of the outside of the runway is probably never going to see a wheel really in anger, except perhaps where aircraft are doing U-turns to backtrack back down the runway. And runways, as we all know, have a very low tolerance of loose stones on their pavement surfaces. They also have a requirement for surface texture, and there's no relaxation of the 1mm surface texture or friction testing requirements as they're applied to regional airports compared to major international airports. And I think that there's a growing trend of facet airport inspectors asking for evidence that regional airports have checked and are maintaining their 1mm surface texture on their spray seals. So it's just something to be aware of, that's a reasonably high priority, at least for some of the CASA inspectors at this point in time. But to achieve a spray seal solution that is suitable to airports, we need different treatments which are unfamiliar from a design perspective to certainly the road spray sealing contractors and potentially local council road engineers who are very familiar and competent when it comes to spray sealing roads, but might not understand these subtle differences that are required to achieve a good airport seal. And there are a number of construction requirements that are quite unusual and different to the road sealing game, which some people will find or comes as a surprise for some people from time to time, particularly the contractors that are being asked to do it. In terms of treatment options, there's a range, and there will always be a range. First coats, I always recommend 2 coats, usually a 14 followed by a 10, and they're the nominal maximum sizes, not the nominal ALDs of the stones. So a 14mm stone, full seal, and then another seal over the top of that with a 10mm stone as a first seal. And that's usually because the 14 will bed a little bit into the underlying base course, especially if it's a marginal material that might be used in a regional airport. Then that second coat is quite important to allow the first coat the stones in the first coat to embed a little bit into the aggregate, and then put a nice new second coat over the top. In terms of reseals, it really depends on the condition of the existing pavement. Single seals, either 10 or 7 usually. I much prefer 10 for a number of reasons that we can talk about later. In terms of 2 coats, 1410 or 147. 1410, the road people quite often tell us, what are we doing that for? Because the second layer should be half the size of the first layer, making 147 correct. But there's, as I said, there's a number of reasons that I prefer a 10mm surface layer, and we'll talk about those in a bit. And of course, there are a number of combinations of those things, and there are different bitumens that can be used as well to change those depending on the circumstances of the job. Getting that seal selection and correct is step one of probably the 3 or 4 things that I see not done as optimally as they could be, particularly in the regional airport space. A number of airports opt for a lockdown treatment. I always say that these things are, let's call them, I think, almost compulsory for runways with jet aircraft operations. The idea is that they go over the top. They're either bitumen, emulsion and sand, so almost like a third seal, a very fine third seal, or in more recent times, some of the proprietary polymer modified emulsion products like Liquid Road, Jet Black, Carbon Seal, Road Seal. There's a number of them. They're about, they're almost equal parts water, sand and bitumen, and that provides a similar finish to the emulsion and sand treatment over the top. The idea of those things is to lock down the stones and try and prevent or minimise loose stones. As I said, particularly for jet aircraft and particularly for runways, not necessarily not necessarily as critical for taxiways and aprons where the aircraft are moving much slower. I said a couple of times that I always prefer a 10mm top layer. Not everybody will subscribe to that philosophy, but yeah, that's my preference. And I inherited that concept from my good friend Ross Monteith, who many people will know, and I've seen no evidence to make me think that Ross didn't have it quite right. And the reasons are that 10mm aggregate, for some reason, seems to, when it's crushed up in a crushing process, always seems to come out a little bit nicer shaped. It's more cubical and more evenly shaped, whereas a 7mm aggregate tends to come out more flaky more often. Not all the time, but more often it'll come out flaky, which means it's a bit more long and elongated, which makes it much harder to build a really good seal out of. The slightly larger ALD associated with a bigger stone also increases embedment, so reduces the risk of stones coming loose. And it also increases the design tolerance. And by tolerance, I mean if we're targeting between 2/3 and 3/4 of the stone ALD being pushed into the bitumen film, then if the ALD is bigger, then the tolerance or the gap between the minimum and the maximum is increased. As you get to smaller and smaller stones, you're essentially reducing your tolerance to where it's, in my view, less. Your tolerance that you're aiming for is actually less than the natural variability of the surface, making it essentially impossible to build a very small sized seal over a typically variable existing surface without getting too much bitumen in some spots and not enough bitumen in others. Also, the 10mm stone will give you an actually slightly greater surface texture, and after you get a few wheels going through the pavement, particularly in the taxiway, and you continue to push the stone into the bitumen film, maybe a little bit more than construction did, and you'll slowly reduce your surface texture over time. And if you've started with more of it in a 10mm size stone, then you'll still have more of it when that process has finished at the end of the seal's life. So you're reducing your risk of running into surface texture or friction issues down the track. Based on that, why not a 14mm stone? A 14mm stone is quite a coarse, provides quite a coarse seal, and whilst we've had aircraft temporarily land on those just during the work, because the work gets done over a week or so, and we've allowed aircraft to land on those larger stone sizes, they do increase tyre wear, and they do tend to scuff a little bit more because the stones get sort of pushed out of the film, the bitumen film, by the tyres. So that doesn't seem to happen as much in the 10mm seal. And the 5mm seal, that's really leaving you zero tolerance. And I've seen multiple airports with 5mm seals over either 10s or 7s underneath, and almost invariably, there's bits of those runways where there's way too much bitumen for the stone, and there's other bits where there's nowhere near enough. And as a result, there'd be flushed bits of seal almost immediately adjacent to bits of seal where the stones have all been whipped off because they weren't ever stuck properly. That to me is not a bad looking seal at the end of its life. You can see in some isolated spots, like just there in the middle, the bitumen has pushed pretty much all the way up the stone, but there's still good texture over large areas of the surface. So to me, that's how I'd be targeting my surface to look at the end of its 10 or so year life expectancy. That's a reasonably new seal with the sand emulsion lockdown treatment applied to it. You can see we've got very little sand on the tops of those larger particles of aggregate, and we've got the sand all pushed in around the stones in between the aggregate particles, locking them in and holding them nicely and tightly locked in together. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to achieve when we put that sand seal over the top. We talked about treatment selection, so just a few other notes about designing spray seals for airports. Is one of those big knots, but don't use road sealing methods. We'll get some rules of thumb towards the end, and if you don't have something that looks like the rules of thumb, then there's a good chance that you've got a road seal and you won't be happy with the result. As I said, from experience and history, the larger aggregate size will provide a better result because it requires more bitumen, and we try to spread the aggregate as lightly as we can without spreading it too lightly, because we don't want any excess stones there, and we've probably all driven on a freshly sealed road and your stones get stuck to your tyres, or they flick up and stick to your mudguards and those kinds of things. And clearly that kind of outcome is unacceptable on a runway, even though it's reasonably well tolerated by the general public on roads. One of the important things is that because we're aiming for such a tight target and such a high performing surface in the airport sealing space, that the design that is come up with in terms of the aggregate and the bitumen application rate, it's really only useful for tendering and for the commencing of the sealing trials on site. You have to then trial and validate that solution prior to starting the works in anger on site with the equipment and the materials that are going to be used for the job. And if you don't then continually monitor that, because you might have variations in your existing pavement or your aggregate material might slowly evolve over time, by the time you get to the other end of the runway, if you haven't continually monitored it and made slight adjustments where appropriate, you might not be putting on an appropriate treatment by the time you get to the other end of your job. So those are very critical things, and recognising that the design is at the end of the design process. It's really just for the purpose of tendering and getting everybody on the same page before you get to the job and do what you actually need to do for your particular surface with your particular materials. These tables came out of a paper I did a couple of years ago for an APA conference in an attempt to provide some guidance on spray seal design for airports. So that paper's publicly available to those interested. To those who just want to know the guts of it, there's really my recommended default design. So if you've got a 14 and a 10 two-coat spray seal as a reseal, then you're really looking at 2.5 and 2, which is 4.5 in total litres per square metre of bitumen. And so you typically on a road that might be 3 to 3.5, probably a full litre less would be an appropriate road solution. And so that just gives you a bit of an idea of what you should be expecting, so that you can have a red flag raised if you're not at least in that ballpark. Moving from the design process into the construction process, weather conditions are so critical to spray sealing, particularly runways, that we can't overestimate or overemphasise these things enough. Rain inhibits the bond between the bitumen film and the stones, and will lead to all the stones stripping off, or a high risk of that occurring. So that's an important thing, that nobody can successfully seal pavements, spray seal pavements in the rain. We talked about the bitumen being sprayed at 180 degrees when it hits the ground, which in winter might be around 5, 10, 15 or 20 degrees. In summer it might be 40, 50 or 70 degrees in the hotter parts of the country. It starts cooling almost straight away. And when the weather's cold, you can't roll the stones in quickly enough, because the bitumen will cool down so quickly when it hits the pavement that there just won't be enough time to get all the rolling done. And that leads to two things. It leads to the stones coming back out, particularly during the winter months. So if you do a seal in May, and then in July, August, September, or July and August, you might see quite a bit of stone loss because you couldn't get the stones pushed in enough. But then when you get to December, the aircraft traffic will push the stones in the rest of the way for you. And if you didn't quite get the design right because you were seeing the stones not going in enough, so you put a bit more bitumen on when you did it in May, by the time you get to December and the stones push the rest of the way in, you might find yourself with too much bitumen, and then you end up with a flushing issue. I have no doubt that the best spray seals on airports are done on the hottest day of the year in that environment. Orange was done when it was 40 degrees, which was the hottest it had been for 5 years, and they got an excellent outcome. Dubbo was done the year before in, I think it was a weekend in early January, and it was stinking hot. And multiple people have said that it's the best seal that they've ever seen on a runway. So I have no doubt that the hottest day of the year is the day you want to target. So I would almost always be targeting December to February in the sort of normal parts of Australia. Of course, there's a big except there because you won't be doing it in December to February in the tropics where it's going to be raining every day. So you're going to have to peg that back to maybe October, November, or April, May, April perhaps, when the rain stopped, but the pavement's still nice and warm and the air temperatures are still reasonably high. The alternate, I'll call it the alternate for now and then explain why it's not really a good alternate, but the alternate to spray sealing in the hottest of weather is to add cutter. So essentially to add a bit of kerosene or something like that to soften the bitumen in cold temperatures so that you increase the time that you've got to roll all the stones in. That allows you to roll the stones in adequately in, let's say, in May. That allows you to roll the stones in adequately in, let's say, in May, and everything will then look okay because you've pushed those stones in until you get to December. And when December comes around and the temperatures heat the pavement back up, that cutter will reactivate and it will re-soften the bitumen, because the unfortunate reality is it doesn't disappear. Certainly doesn't disappear the day you finish the job, and then you'll almost certainly get significant flushing as the bitumen pushes, or the stones push all the way into the bitumen film, and you end up with free bitumen on the top, and then you really have an issue on your hands. There was a number of airports that with grant funding in Western New South Wales used significant amounts of cutter to seal their runways in June and July of 2015 in particular. And I recently had the opportunity to visit a number of those airports. They've all got similar issues, and I have no doubt that they all stem to the fact that they sealed their runways in the cold months, and they used a whole bunch of cutter to, in theory, allow them to do that and do what needed to be done. And now they're probably paying a little bit of a price for having. So I guess the big knot at the bottom of that is, my advice to any airport is that it is if you can't get your sealing done in that optimal December to February, unless you're in the tropics time of the year, then you really need to wait until the next year, and you shouldn't consider sealing in May, June, July and August and those winter months. You shouldn't really be entertaining that as a serious option, because your risk of being unhappy with the outcome increases exponentially every time you get a little bit further away from the good summer months. The next one, so here's an example of what, I've talked about flushing a few times, so this probably isn't the worst example that we've got around, but it's not a bad one. You can see there that the stones are pushed all the way in, the bitumen's now sitting on top of the stones, and you can even see in here the tyre tread marks. So they're the grooves in the aircraft tyres where the aircraft tyre is actually squeezing that free bitumen up and into the little voids of in the grooves in the tyre. and that will just get progressively worse until either the airport decides it's unacceptable or they'll put some treatment over the top. But it's very, very difficult to treat those things. And really in severe cases, the only treatment option is to remove that surface and starve over, which is quite a drastic step to have to take without any doubt. One of the other key elements of spray seal construction is control. The sprayers go really quickly, so if you start spraying and let the sprayer go from one end of your runway to the other, you'll be almost finished by the time your aggregate tippers get onto the seal and start doing their job. The tippers are much slower than the sprayer, and they'll always lag behind, and the rolling is much slower again. So my advice is to limit the runs to 350 metres or thereabouts. 350 metres is a reasonably convenient length, because generally it'll provide for a good consumption or use or efficient use of all the bitumen that can reasonably fit inside a sprayer. So it's a reasonably efficient length because you're not then refilling half-filled sprayers. And the other thing that 350 metres will generally do is it won't require the tippers to be refilled mid-run. So you imagine if you went from one end of your runway all the way to the other end of the runway, that the tippers wouldn't make it, they'd run out. And the process of that tipper coming all the way back up and then another tipper going all the way back down to finish that runoff, it takes a long time. And all that time the bitumen is cooling down more and more and just making it harder and harder to push those stones in. So 350 metres is a good length. A couple of questions coming in, so we'll get to those when we just get to the end of this little section that we're on at the moment. So you can see there, right down in the distance, that's the sprayer. He's doing his job down the end, or he's probably finished there, or no, he's still going. And you've got three tippers chasing him all the way down. So the first two tippers would be covering 2 metres or thereabouts each. Oh, it looks like there's a fourth one in there, so they might just be lining up to have the next crack. So it might be 2 of them down, and then the next 2 just to finish off the third bit in that very wide spray that would have gone down that runway. So we might answer those couple of questions before we get on to rolling. So Kieran's asked what we can do to dry the aggregate out if it's rained. Wait until it's dried out. Probably the hardest thing, and it will dry out reasonably quickly. The hardest thing well, certainly prevention's better than the cure, and tarping it up or something before it rains would have been a smart thing to do. The hardest thing to dry out is the sand. So if you're doing a sand emulsion treatment, if your sand's even a little bit wet, it'll just clag up and it won't come out of those tippers. And then you're in big strife because you just physically can't get it out of the trucks. I have seen quite successfully a couple of contractors actually run the sand through an asphalt plant to completely dry it out so that it could not have any moisture left in it at all. And that was quite good, and that was quite successful. Warren's asked, staying tender during the hot period and being damaged by aircraft turning. I think that goes for any bituminous product, whether it be asphalt or spray seal, but certainly spray seals, even without cutter, they'll still be tender and soft in the first probably week in particular after they're sprayed, and to get them through that period without damaging them, it's clearly the best thing to do is to keep the aircraft going straight and trying, or at least using maximum radius turns and only turning at the turning nodes rather than mid-runway where they'll be forced to turn tighter. It's a good point, Warren, thanks. How do you treat cutter-related issues? I think I mentioned that it's extremely difficult to treat that. It's very dangerous. Having done it or attempted it once and being unsuccessful, I can speak from experience that it's extremely dangerous to try and reseal over the top of that. It's probably theoretically possible, but in practice, fraught with danger. So the way that they can either be treated by scattering more stones on to sort of mop up that bitumen, but generally those stones will fall back off in winter because they're not really held as well as they should be, and then the flushing will start again. So it becomes almost a maintenance exercise on an ongoing basis. But the real solution, as I said, is to actually scrape that off and start again. You can also try water cutting. So removing it with like a line marking removal high pressure water cutter or blaster. Needs to be done extremely carefully so you don't remove all the stones as well. And Ben's added the same comment that yes, there from an operational and keeping it open and operating perspective, there's certainly value in rolling small stones like a 5mm stone into those flushed surfaces as a temporary issue, because it'll at least stop bitumen getting stuck to aircraft tyres. But as I said, my experience is that those small stones have then come back off the seal in winter time, and so might need to be reapplied when you get back to summer. Lloyd asks, what's the minimum recommended temperature to initiate sealing? So I think the old department specifications talked about adding cutter, interestingly enough. Once you're above 15 degrees and below 25 degrees, so my view is if you want to completely avoid cutter, which is always my recommendation, then you really need to be above that pavement temperature 25 degrees, which unless you're in Western New South Wales or the southern half of the country, you'll get that almost immediately as soon as the sun hits the pavement surface. But all of the spray sealing crews have little infrared temperature guns, and they can tell you exactly when that is. Certainly, if you're sealing your runway at the right time of the year, you won't have any issue getting temperature, or you shouldn't have anyway. What else have we got here? Temperature, it's the same question twice. So I think I've covered all those. So back to rolling. Because on runways we can't tolerate loose stones, then embedding the aggregate into the bitumen film is absolutely key. It's probably the most important thing we do on the whole job. And we can't rely on vehicles to finish it off like the road people do. And for that reason, we typically require 2 to 4 times more rolling on a runway than we do on a road. And in fact, the rollers, because they're the slowest part of the operation, they almost always will govern the productivity of the sealing. So how much sealing can be done in a day? The answer to that on a runway is it depends on how many rollers you've got to roll it when you're finished. And I found a document with guidance to regional airports from a long time ago, I can't remember the year, provided by our friend Tom. And it said 1 roller hour per 500 litres of sprayed bitumen, which is actually about 50% more than the current generations are specifying, which is 1 roller hour per 800 litres. So you can spray more bitumen for the same number of rollers. When you calculate that out, 6 rollers times 10 hours a day, assuming that they don't stop from the start of the work to the finish of the work, gives you about 50,000 litres of bitumen. And the important thing to note is that a typical spraying operation can spray 50,000 litres of bitumen sometime between morning tea and lunchtime. So the sprayer will be finished at lunchtime and he'll be very tempted to want to keep going. But if you want to stick to good practice, which is, and you've got 6 rollers on site, then 50,000 litres in the day is all that you'll ever reasonably get to spray. It's worth noting there that rolling the next day doesn't really count. So you can't sort of do 100,000 litres today and then roll it tomorrow without spraying any extra and saying you've caught up, because by tomorrow the bitumen will be that much cooler again, that the rolling will be much less effective. Typical roller fleet, so I think there's all 6 of them there, so that's a good thing. I think that was actually at Orange, it was about 42 degrees, and I think Orange Airport remains very happy with that bit of seal. I actually have some other seal on a runway extension that wasn't done. It was done to the same general specification, but it certainly wasn't done on a day when it was 40 degrees in Orange, which is very rare, and it does have some issues that they need to address, but certainly the main original length of the runway looks extremely good, and I have no doubt it's because we were lucky to have a really hot day at January when we did that work. As much as we try to push all the stones into the surface, they'll always be loose stones, and because we need to minimise the level of loose aggregate after the job's finished, then sweeping is critically important. It's also extremely important to sweep in between seal layers, as well as at the end of the job and after we use the steel drum roller, which we'll talk about in a bit. A typical road's only 5 or 6 metres wide. Runway to the edge of a runway is either 15 or 22, or depending on your runway width, but they're probably the majority of them. So you end up with a large amount of material by the time you push it all the way to the edge of the runway, which really means that the single broom that the contractor, that spray sealing crews would typically bring to a job, will struggle to get all that rolling done, particularly if it's not a nice new super powerful machine. It's also good to have a suction sweeper just to finish everything off. So the broom's good at moving the big particles, and the suction sweeper's good at then going back over and just picking up all the little fine bits and pieces that the broom, or the tractor broom, sometimes just pushes into the texture within the surface. If you've done a really, really good job on your seal, you won't need to re-sweep it after 1 or 2 months, but I think it's good practice to allow or to anticipate that might be required. A couple of months later, just lets everything settle down, give it another sweep. I think Dubbo did that when we did their surface in 2016, and they haven't swept it since. In fact, now it's asphalt, because it was asphalt overlaid for strength in January this year, January and February, and my understanding is that they didn't sweep it once in the 2 years in between, because that seal, again, on a 40-degree day and diligently done, returned a great result. That's just an example. That's the sand emulsion or the sand from the sand emulsion being swept back off a runway. You can see the volume of the material there, and I assure you that tractor broom was moving very slowly by that point in time, and 2 tractors would have been extremely useful on that particular job. We mentioned the steel drum roller. Hard aggregates, which is what we're always asking for, have got sharp edges, and they can wear the tyres excessively as they touch down. Steel drum rolling helps remove those sharp tops. The smaller the drum, the better, because it can get in all the nooks and crannies everywhere. But never in vibrating mode. In vibrating mode, you've got a good chance of damaging the seal and crushing the stones. And this whole idea of steel drum rolling, a typical spray sealing crew will shake their head and think you've been smoking happy weed, but I assure you it's a critical thing for spray sealing airports. Here's an example of sort of the outcome of that. So that's a seal. That's not a little bit fuzzy, that picture, but we'll just have to bear with it, I suppose. But I've put yellow circles around all the stones that you could see would have been sitting proud and had sharp edges, and they've just been knocked off. So the stones haven't been completely pulverised. We've just knocked the tops off them. And again, completely fine idea. And I was a bit nervous, I must admit, the first time I asked somebody to do it, and I had a contractor who didn't like the idea, but we did it, and he actually said afterwards, how much better the seal looked after having done it compared to before, because everything just sort of looked flatter and neater. tidier. A couple more questions, so we'll just do those before we get to the economics and the logistics of it, which brings us pretty much to the end. Thoughts on using aggregate or Gilsa seal to treat bleeds or flushing? You know, I understand the concept, Warren. It's not something that I've ever done, and it's not something that I have any specific experience with. It's worth noting that usually I turn to the rest of the world when there's something that I need to try and figure out if there's a good answer to. But because outside of Australia, very, very few countries entertain spray sealing runways. If you tell Americans that you put spray seals on marginal crush rocks and land 737s on them, they think that you've been smoking that same happy weed at lunchtime. So if we're going to figure things like that out, we need to figure them out for ourselves. I don't know that it's ever been attempted on an airport pavement, but it's certainly a question worthy of further thought, that's for sure. Kieran, multiple eye rollers only on what weight? So my view is that the weight of the rollers is far less important than the speed and the number. So nice and slowly, and lots of them. Usually they're multiple. They're static, pneumatic tied rollers. There are a number of rollers around that are vibrating pneumatic rollers, and there are some that have got like a drive wheel on the back or wheels on the back and rolling wheels on the front. But yeah, generally it's pneumatic tied rollers, and I really do like the vibrating rollers, to the point where I'm happy to give them credit as being worth 2 of the static rollers. So if you've got 3, if you had 4, let's say you had 4 static rollers and 1 vibrating pneumatic roller, which I think only one company currently makes, and I think most of the contractors have them in New South Wales, but not outside of New South Wales. But if you've got 4 and 1, then I'm happy to count that one as 2, and therefore you've got 6 in total. You can base your productivity on that. Another question is, do you steel drum roll every seal layer or just the final layer? Yeah, so you would never steel drum roll the sand emulsion or the lockdown treatment. I did ask my friend Ross Monteith this once, because his specification said that you had to steel drum roll all the layers. I said, Ross, if this is only for the tyre wear, then surely we really only need to do the top layer. And his response was a little chuckle, and he said, yeah, but it's good practice for them. But I would only ever ask you to steel drum roll the final layer, which would usually either be a 7, or if you take my advice and prefer a 10, then it would be a 10. But it certainly wouldn't be put on a sand, and you know, I don't really see the benefit in doing it on the layers below, unless you're going to have those layers there for some period of time with aircraft landing directly on them. Jim makes a very good point, which is that that sealing really, certainly in my view, I don't know that it was Jim's view or whether it was a question, but my view very strongly is, if your runway is too busy to be sealed by closing it for periods in the day, then it's too busy to be sealed. Because of the visual nature of getting a seal right, and because you're doing the trials, and then you need to continually monitor to make sure that you're still putting an appropriate amount of bitumen and aggregate down in every spray run every day, you can't do those things at night. And so if you're an airport with RPT and you're too busy to seal your airport in the day, then you're too busy to have a spray seal on your runway, and you should seriously consider an asphalt overlay, which is far more conducive to being done at night than spray sealing is. I've only seen a couple of airports that have been spray sealed at night, and in both cases the outcome was far from what everybody would have thought was good and suitable. Again, not saying that it's not physically possible, just that it's extremely high risk and you're likely not to be satisfied with the answer. So in terms of the economics of spray sealing, a good seal should last you between 8 to 12 years, especially if you put your lockdown treatment down and perhaps come back and put another lockdown treatment down when the first one's substantially eroded, maybe by year 8 or 9. In terms of costs for a typical 1500 by 30 metre wide runway, spray seal might cost you $800,000 versus an asphalt overlay, which has got every chance of being in the order of $4 million for the same area. So if you just annualise those over the expected life, the life expectancy of both options, then you'll probably come out seeing that, because the two asphalt won't last that much longer than a spray seal if both are done reasonably well, that your annual depreciation is getting close to $500,000 a year for asphalt, but it's less than $100,000 a year. So I think I just make this point because a number of airports have been given grant money recently, and they've put asphalt on their runway with that grant money, which is quite an appropriate thing to do, and I certainly good on them for doing it. But then when you say to them, well, in 10 years' time, you're going to put another asphalt overlay on because you're going to need another $4 million to do it, they all of a sudden realise that they've now upgraded their surface, and to keep it upgraded, they need to invest at something like 5 times the annual depreciation and put that away so that they've got enough money in the kitty, or they'll be forced to go back to whoever gave them a grant in a year's time and ask for another one. The economics of sealing increases as you get more and more remotely, and that's just because of the mobility of the equipment. Jim predicted one of those big red words that says never seal at night, as we talked about. If your runway is too busy to seal it in the day, then it's too busy for a spray seal. You better go and buy some asphalt. Just to demonstrate the logistical issues, this is from Dubbo Airport, actually, the last day of the job. That's essentially every bit of kit you need, except there's not enough rollers in the picture to spray seal a runway anywhere in the country. The only other things you need are the rest of the rollers, maybe another sweeper, and a big truck to deliver the bitumen to, but it can go pretty much anywhere. In contrast, deliver the bitumen to, but it can go pretty much anywhere. In contrast, that's from a recent project that that's funnily enough, that's Dubbo as well from this year when we put asphalt on it in January and February, and that's the mobile asphalt plant required to do a job like that. So you have to. It's not hard to recognise that that's a lot easier to move around the country than one of those is, and that's a big part of that logistics and economics. Unanswered questions, there's not too many, but this is usually when they start flowing in. But aggregate pre-coating, bitumen base or diesel base, that's a good question. My view is that best practice would be a cutback bitumen based free coat, but I do understand that there are sometimes some advantages, timing and logistics wise, to use a diesel-based pre-coat. I think both are reasonably proven, and I don't know that we should be worried or concerned about one or the other, but it's certainly a fair question. I think that the key to the pre-coating, which for those that don't know is just a fine spray to the aggregate particles a day or two or a week or so before they're used and spread on the runway or on the bitumen film in order to increase the bond between the bitumen and the stones. So it's a good point. Thanks, Josh. I think the key to either of those things is making sure you got a little bit of anti-stripping agent in there, typically 0.5 or 1% or something like that. So that probably negates most of the question around which one it should be. I think most organisations or most authorities allow both these days. So if there's no more questions, because most of them we addressed as we went along, the key bits are that spray seals aren't for road spray seals aren't for airports, and some of the design and the construction issues will be quite unfamiliar to those who do it and to those who sometimes design it. And the most important issues are the stone sizes and the combinations, the aggregate spread and the bitumen spray rate, so the design stuff. And in the construction elements, it's really the rolling effort and the sweeping effort, as well as not doing it in cold weather. Clearly, spray sealing is economically very advantageous, particularly to regional airports. But if you don't get it right, and you've got 2 or 3 years on, you've got the headache of wondering what you're going to do, then you're certainly not going to get the return on investment that you would have if you do it at the right time of the year. And whilst there are 737s landing on spray seal runways every day around the country, it's not asphalt, and you've got to go into a spray sealing or a spray seal operation on a runway acknowledging that it's not going to give you the same outcome as asphalt will in terms of its appearance and in terms of its almost complete freedom from loose aggregate. But certainly there's a long history of spray sealing runways, and if you do it right and you do it diligently, then there's absolutely no reason why it can't be suitable for anything up to a 737 sized aircraft a couple of days a week, as long as you can make the window available to do the work in the day, and as long as you invest in doing it properly when you actually do it. Just before we finish that off, Josh has also asked about maintenance rolling and the use following construction to keep the bitumen lively, which is another good point, and certainly something in the details. But my advice to airports: if you build your seal well and you want to get 10, 12, maybe even more years out of it, instead of getting maybe 6, 8 or 10 years out of it, then one of the best things to do is to re-roll it every year. Because as Josh says, it seems to keep the bitumen lively, and there's a bit of science that actually supports how that works and why it works, which I won't delve into now. But certainly there's an expectation that if you get a nice big pneumatic tide roller and run it up and down the runway for 2 afternoons on the stinking hottest days of the year, then your seal will age better than if you just believe that you've done a good job at the time of building it and you don't need to think about it or revisit it ever again for the next 10 years. So that's really the end for me, unless any more questions come through. I think our hour's just about up. As I said, the next one in the series is on pavement strength, ACN, PCN. It'll be in a couple of months' time, or on the 4th of July, which is a couple of months. In the meantime, if you want to talk more about spray seals or the research at the university or anything else, my details are there, or I'm not too hard to find, I don't think, anyway. So thank you, David, and thank you, Redback, and we'll talk again on the 4th of July. Or perhaps,
thanks, Greg. Thanks, Greg. It was a great presentation, and I'll sort of begin the wrap up as well. If there's any more questions that come through, feel free to respond to them, or Greg's email address was on the screen there as well, so feel free to drop him a line. Thanks to all of our members for participating in today's session. These sessions are obviously interactive and two-way with some great questions that hopefully everybody found useful as well. What we'd ask that you now take a moment to complete a short survey that you will see on the right-hand side of your screen. Please ensure you hit the orange submit button once you've completed all of the questions. To respond to one of the previous questions as well, this webinar will be made available to members via the Airport Professional webinar page in the coming week. And we encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered by emailing us at events@airports.asn.au. It's always good to have any other suggestions about particular topics that the membership would find particularly useful. So please let us know any thoughts on that. For further details of the next AAA webinar, they will be released in the next edition of the Airport Alert, which will be on the 5th of April. The link to register will be distributed by Redback shortly after. I'd also like to let you know that Greg will be presenting the next Pavement update webinar on pavement fitness and ACN PCN in June, and more details and invitations will be released close to the date. If you'd like further information, please email the AAA events team. Again, our email address is events@airports.asn.au. Today's webinar recording will be available in the Airport Alert and emailed to everyone directly once available. So were there any other questions or responses required, Greg, before we close off the webinar?
No, I haven't seen any more arrive, so I'm happy if everyone else is happy.
Okay, if there's any other questions, as I say, Greg's contact details are there, so maybe drop him a line directly. And on that note, as we've just clicked over midday in New South Wales, thank you very much, everybody, again for your participation, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. And